Okay, now we're moving south to the Andes. So we're continuing a whirlwind tour, but in a different whirlwind tour. Um, but like the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire was, it's very well known to us because it was important at the time of the Spanish arrival, but it was actually fairly recent as well. At the time of the Spanish arrival, the Inca developed and flourished in Cuzco from about the 1100s through the 1300s, but as a small nation state, but didn't expand to conquer the other areas and become the Incan Empire until after 1440. So the Inca Empire as such, the way that we understand, the way that we think about it and the way that the Spaniards encountered it really only existed from about 1440 until its fall in 1532, just 10 years or so after the fall of the Aztec Empire. So the capital city of the Incan Empire was Cusco in modern day Peru. And the Inca had originated as a particular ethnic group living in the valley of Cusco in the 1100s. They then rose to develop first a small city state, in Cusco, and then to grow into the largest empire in Latin America, even bigger than the Aztec Empire. They built and expanded Cusco as they did this. And so by the time the Spaniards arrived, it was the largest and most thoroughly administered state in Latin America. And Cusco held, equally profound religious significance for the people, for the Inca and for people around it, as did Tenochtitlan to the people who lived there and lived in the region. The Incas saw themselves as both a class, like an economic class, a social class, and an ethnic group headed by a ruler called the Sapo Inca, which was the supreme leader of the Inca. The Sapo Inca was considered divine, and the Inca saw themselves and their authority as divinely ordained and divinely mandated. They were a people with a distinct kind of cosmological origin. They saw themselves as coming from a different place than all the rest of the Andean people that they ruled, or that they administered over. Most people of the Andes understood themselves as having come from the earth, very similarly to the way that the Mesoamerican folks I talked to you about, having emerged from the center of the earth, emerged from a very particular center, having been, born in the navel of the earth where all other nature also originated, etc. So, and many of the Andean cosmologies, people, told stories about themselves as having their bodies actually being made of the same material of the earth, actually being literally made out of the earth. And they also believed that their dead returned to the earth, making particular places in the landscape sacred and dense with ancestral presence, and literally infused with the spirit of the ancestors. So this was the way that Andean cosmology was in general. But the Inca did not dispute that. The Inca understood and reinforced the Andean ideas of the way that most of the people, their subject peoples, had originated, etc., and supported these kinds of local cosmologies. But their story was that they themselves, the Inca, that one of the things that made them special and different was that they alone were the children of the sun, sent to rule the children of the earth. So they understood themselves as having a different cosmological origin. The establishment of their empire then was done through a kind of redirection of natural forces, not through a conquering and taming of nature, also different from the Europeans that would come, but through a bold participation in it, like a divinity, like the way that we might think of and be more familiar with the Greek gods having, come and interfered. Although the Greek gods tended to be a little more chaotic, the Incan were like the Aztec in the sense that, their prophecy said that they would come and would be key human figures in uniting the forces of the earth and the sky, that the Inca understood themselves to actually be, at least the Sapo Inca was divine, was a god, and and that the Incan people were descended from the sun and were sent to rule the people of the earth and to redirect and to reorganize the forces of nature for the harmony and better of all people. So the important thing about this was that the reigning Inca, the Sapo Inca, was thought to hold the ordering and life-giving power of the sun. That without him, the sun would not continue to give the generative power that it had to help things grow and to order what was happening there on the earth. There was an intimate relationship between the earth and the sun in Incan cosmology, but the idea was that without the sun, the earth couldn't survive at all. The Inca were there to give life to the children of the earth and to perfect their relationship with the divine forces through their mediation. They didn't replace, as I said, Andean reverence to the earth, but they did encourage widespread devotion to Inti, which was the Incan name for the divine force of the sun, or the sun god. And the worship or devotion to the sun became the imperial religion. But like Tenochtitlan, the construction of Cuzco expressed this idea of divinely ordained imperial destiny in the physical layout of the city. The importance of the 5 directions was also present, with Cuzco as the center. Cuzco was imagined as the navel of the world, but it also had a map of the entire Incan Empire laid out on it. So lines of sacred direction and sacred power marked the pathways of the sun and the earth and the appearance of heavenly bodies. Buildings were constructed in such a way that the travels of these celestial bodies would cast shadows in purposefully timed, extremely complex ways in order to tell certain stories, in order to tell particular parts of the history and represent the history of the Inca and its empire. But unlike the Mexica, the Inca were not outsiders. They understood themselves as to have been descended from a different place, descended from the sun, but they, the history of their human history was that they were, in fact, a particular ethnic group that had always been there and that rose to power from the place that they then outwardly spread their empire, rose up in Cuzco. So they originated in this valley of Cuzco that also was one of those kind of sacred centers. And they built the city between 1100 and 1440, as I mentioned before. So under Sapo Inca, I always have a little bit of a hard time saying his name because I'm not as familiar with Quechua as I am Nahuatl. So Pacacuti Kusi Yupangu, whose name means earth shaker. And this was the original, the original imperial Sapo Inca, expanded through both conquest and diplomacy to establish this huge empire that stretched from modern day Ecuador to, in the north, all the way to Chile and Argentina in the south. Prior to the Incas, there had been 2 great states in the area before. They were not the first of these big empires. Much like in Mesoamerica, there had been rise and fall, but not as many. So there were 2 great states that I'll just mention quickly. Between 600 and 800, around the time of the height of the Mayan civilization in the north, and also around the time of Teotihuacan. So around the height of the Mayan civilization in southern Mesoamerica, and simultaneously the power of Teotihuacan in the Valley of Mexico, there was a major empire in the Andes as well, and it was called Tiwanaku. And Tiwanaku grew up in modern day Bolivia around Lake Titicaca. And simultaneously, the Wari emerged in the coastal valleys and the adjacent highlands of modern-day Peru. So around Lake Titicaca, oh my gosh, Titicaca, around Lake Titicaca and modern-day Bolivia, we have the Tiwanaku, and then along the coastal valleys and highlands of modern-day Peru, we have the Wari people, Huari. I'll have all of these on some terms for you. Both of these cultures were long gone by the time that the Inca came to power, but like Mexica, the Incas drew on their memories to justify their rule. But they also rose to power by building on local religious traditions and local cultural practices, laying their own imperial cosmology on top of local Andean ones. And this is important to keep in mind. So Incan religion and culture is by no means the same as Andean. And that gets mixed up, of course, through the lens of Spanish colonialism. The Spaniards totally didn't understand this, and they tended to call everything Andean Incan. So you can't trust Spanish sources when they say that somebody was an Incan, was Incan, or that something was Incan. It often was not. The descendants of Andean Native Americans also adopt the regal history of the Incans and call themselves Incans, even if they were not actually part of that, descended from that ethnic group. But in terms of religious and cultural practices, local Andean earth-related concepts and practices actually tended to be more persistent and lasted far longer and still exist in the region, far more than the sun-based imperial religion of the Inca. And this is true actually in Mesoamerica as well. It was easier for Spaniards to topple the imperial religion, very, very hard for them to get rid of the long history of much more local religious and cultural practices, which still persist today in Mesoamerica. The same is true in the Andes. And a strong example of the persistence of local, Andean traditions is the presence of huacas, Huacas. A huaca was a physical or symbolic expression of divine or sacred presence. It was a physical object, often part of the landscape itself, but sometimes manipulated by human hands. So, it could be, a rock or a lake or something, natural, but it also could be a stone that had been carved or things like that. So, but whatever it was a physical object or a physical place that was infused with the sacred. And it was understood as a kind of point of communication with the divine. Huacas were not themselves gods. They were not themselves the figures sometimes that Andean histories speak about communicating through these points, but they were the ways that divine energy or divinity could be reached or communicated with. So this is important because Spaniards misunderstood this concept, and they talked about huacas as if they were idols, as if they were statues or idols and things that you could locate and smash. And they were forever trying to locate and smash huacas. They talked about them as idols, and they talked about these extirpation of idolatry campaigns where they would go around looking for huacas and smashing them. But this was a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept, because though a huaca could be something you could smash, like a small stone or a carved piece of wood, it could also be, and often was, something like a cave or an enormous boulder or an entire mountain itself. So you couldn't actually get rid of, a great many huacas. Huacas had an intimate relationship with both ancestor spirits and divine forces related to the earth and the sky and heavenly bodies, meaning planets and stars and things like that. Huacas were the place where humans fed or otherwise nurtured these divine beings and forces. And again, there was an understanding that humans had a really important role to play in the continuing care of these forces of nature and continuing care of the earth, but also they were intimately caring for their ancestors when they were doing this as well. In both pre-Inca and Andean traditions, painted stone tablets were often offered to the Huacas as ways of doing this. And both in pre-Incan, Andean, and also Incan traditions, animals, food offering, and precious goods were left at the Huacas in order to feed these forces and also to feed the ancestors. The sacred was present in different Huacas with different levels of density. That was the other way that it was understood. So they were tended to on different scales within society. For instance, deceased people were often buried under boulders that had a natural space underneath them and then filled in. And then these boulders could become collective burial grounds for families and kin groups. And then these boulders then would become huacas, and offerings were left to these ancestor spirits by particular families, and eventually by kin and descent groups known as Ayllu, Aylllu. But then, there were also these more large-scale huacas where sacred energy was extremely dense. So these tended to be mountains or particular rock formations on a mountain peak, or bodies of water in a mountainous area. And these huacas were associated then with entire communities or by many communities. And these could be associated with powerful or generations of ancestors, but also generally associated directly with the cosmic and divine forces and what we might call deities. So these Andean notions of sacred as being, a cumulative and increasingly dense over time were very difficult for Spaniards to get rid of. In fact, they never did. And the concept of tending to huacas is still very vibrant in many parts of the Andes today. It's also true that Incan religious practices and the Incan legacy proved more persistent actually than the Mexica did in central Mexico. It's not to say that local Mesoamerican traditions were easily replaced by Christianity. That's not true at all. But the kind of high Aztec religion, we don't see very much persistence of, except in a kind of resurgence in Neo-Aztec, and I mean to use that term specifically because this is how people talk about it today, Neo-Aztec philosophy and intellectual traditions that emerged in the 1980s and 90s in particular. But other than that, you really don't see the same kind of local representations or continuations of things that look like high religion in Mesoamerica. You do see a little bit more persistence of Incan intellectual traditions in the Andes today, and at least throughout the colonial period and into the 19th century. The difference in the resilience of Incan religious practices as well as political power to that of the Mexica may have something to do with the way that the Inca treated local Andean traditions. And this is my reason for making that comparison, is because I want to talk to you about this particular aspect of the relationship. Remember, I talked about the real tension between these outsiders who were the Mexica and the way that they held their power, and the kind of instability of the power in relationship to forced human sacrifice and the flowery wars and things like that, and the ways that the Spaniards found it easy to exploit these tensions and use the native allies to help them overthrow the power of the Mexica and the Aztec Empire. That is different from the relationship between the Inca and their subject peoples. So the Mexica did allow local traditions to continue, while insistent on their own imperial religion through which they justified their rule. But the Inca were more intimately engaged with local religious traditions, actually supported local religious traditions. The notion that these people were the children of the earth, and that they were the children of the sun sent to help nourish them was an important part of their political power. So they frequently co-opted large-scale religious traditions by doing things like building temples to the sun nearby a mountain that was a mountain waka, not as competition with these wakas, but as an acknowledgement of their sacred power. Like, this is so important, we're going to build a temple to the sun right next to it. And they also often encouraged local traditions by providing more resources and more materials. So by organizing more people to propitiate particularly popular large-scale wakas. So, they saw that something was really important, and they would, marshal resources from all over their empire and give more materials and resources to further particular cultural and religious, what we might call religious practices around these sacred centers. And on the very local level, they generally respected or left alone family and kin group waka practices. There were, however, sometimes changes. For instance, the Inca did not consider the painted tablet tradition acceptable for one reason or another, and so they tried to encourage other types of offerings. Even in this instance, however, they tended to go about their reforms simply by fostering other practices and letting the stone temple tradition, or the painted tablet tradition wither rather than actively suppressing it. The word reforms is important in understanding the Inca. They justified their rule by claiming to be religious reformers. Okay, that's important. They were not outsiders like the Mexica, and they shared the basic cosmology of their region, but they believed that the gods or divine forces wanted them to restore order to the spiritual practices of the region. They presented their mission as returning to a more pure religious practice that had become corrupted over time. There's some parallels there of the Mexica, claiming to be building on the Toltecs and the people of Teotihuacan, but nonetheless, they were bringing order from the outside, and this is different. The painted tablet tradition is an example of that. So the Inca believed that offerings should be things that were precious to the humans that gave them, and that the value of these things was intrinsic to the material themselves rather than symbolic. So gold and silver or luxury goods, and in some cases, perhaps human life itself, was more appropriate than the stone, which had been painted to represent these things. So the stone tablets might have images of these kinds of luxury goods on them, but the Inca thought that it was more appropriate to actually bring those luxury goods themselves. In other instances, the Inca did not find it necessary to change certain large-scale practices. So, for instance, if a particular community had resisted Incan rule, the Incan forces might occupy that community and might declare that this community's favored large-scale waka had gone mute or powerless. In the places where they did this, though, however, they tended to encourage devotion to some other previously existing waka. They didn't, create their own or insist only on devotion to the Temple of the Sun that they built or something like that. So, for instance, there's a particular place known as Cotahuasi, where there was a strong and persistent resistance to Incan rule. So the Incan forces in this place tried to do away with the devotion to a mountain known as the ancient Alca, but at the same time encouraged devotion to another great mountain, waka, another mountain waka, known as Solimana. Okay, so that's, just an example of one of the things that how they would handle resistance that was less, in some ways less oppressive or entirely subjugating than the way that the Mexica sometimes handled their opposition. So when the Inca brought religious change, they did so by changing particular details or practices. And these practices, I'm sure, were traumatic for local communities, not saying that they weren't, but they weren't incomprehensible within their cosmos. So the Inca they did see themselves as having a different cosmological origin, as I mentioned, than the people around them. They were children of the sun, and everyone else was children of the earth. But their human history had originated in Cuzco, and they shared certain core cultural and spiritual concepts with their subject peoples. Because of this, and because the Inca were also masterful at diplomacy, and this is they really were, actually the Spaniards, individual Spaniards actually wrote a lot and talked a lot about and worked with the Incan elite to perfect the art of political diplomacy. Actually, there's a whole long intellectual tradition of exchange about these kinds of concepts. So that because of this, the Inca didn't try to make radical changes in underlying cultural and religious principles, and that probably led to a greater strength in their political power. But the most significant thing about this is that this was very, very, very different from what the Spaniards would do when they tried to impose Christianity on Andean religion and Andean culture. So one of these core religious concepts that were shared by Andean communities and the Inca, who were also an Andean community, but understood themselves to be different, was the idea of circulating life forces, the belief that human beings, by making offerings to the gods and divine forces through their wakas, assisted the continual balance and correct flow of this circulating life force. Okay, so it's a little bit different than the Mesoamerican notion of opposing forces and balance, but not entirely different. But just the circulating life forces was a particular thing that was very important in Andean conceptions of the world. One particular scholar, Justin Jennings, who I will mention, has written about this a lot, and the way that this similarity helped the Incan Empire make religious changes when necessary. And so a lot of what I'm going to say for the rest of this time comes from his research. In the Andean worldview, the world, and so Justin Jennings is sort of like how I think about David Carrasco. Those are the two scholars that I most trust when thinking about this really hard to understand pre-Columbian concepts of the world, cosmology, etc. So in the Andean worldview, the world and the cosmos is made up of circulating currents of water, air, blood, and life force that exists in all of these things. And this life force was known as Sami. So streams flow down mountainsides into the jungles and then return again to the mountains through rain. The ancestors sprang up from the earth's soil, and then the dead return to the earth through the soil. And then they nourish that soil for future generations of, with their death. Blood circulates through the body in a never-ending cycle until it, along with the rest of the body, comes to rest and returns to the earth, and then, becomes a part of this larger circulation of Sami. Through these currents, the essence of life, or life forces, flows through the world in a circular manner, making a closed ring. Life forces run through the body into the earth and then into the cosmos, connecting humans to the rest of the universe. This is a way of understanding, just a general way of understanding the way that all of nature, that all of the world, that all of sacred and natural forces, again, no division between natural and supernatural. That is common to indigenous ways of seeing the world, beyond the Andes, beyond Mesoamerica, etc. But so I got lost a little bit. I don't remember. I was going somewhere in particular, but I kind of lost. So let me return to my notes. So through these currents, the essence of life, or life force, flows in this closed circuit, in this closed ring. I think that's what I was trying to say, is that there's a connection from the human body to the earth and then to the larger cosmos. And there's nothing outside of that. There's nothing outside of this sacred ring. There's not a creator God that's outside of all of this. This is the way that, the sacred, the divine, the natural exists in these circular forces. Okay. So when humans die, they do go to a new level of participation in these cycles. And after a time, the deceased become ancestors who have a different density of this kind of or a different role in these circular in the circulation of the sacred life force. As ancestors, they actually join the cycles of cosmic cosmic energy, and then return to the earth to either help or punish the living. So Andean belief in these cycles did not mean that everything always went smoothly in this process of circulation. And in fact, human beings had an important role to play in making sure that these cycles continued to flow easily and naturally. But also, divine and natural forces, as well as ancestors, could misbehave. They were thought to be both creative and destructive, sometimes angry and capricious and jealous and things like that. And they were in need of devotion and tending. And if you did it wrong, and if you ignored them and you let them, feel abandoned, they could go mute. They could become punishing. They could interrupt the cycle in ways that were harmful. So, like Mesoamerican religious thought, living humans had to play a crucial role in the harmonious functioning of the cosmos. Ancestors needed to be cared for and assisted in their journeys, becoming a larger part of this cosmos. And divine forces needed to be tending to, and they needed thanks, and they needed appreciation, they needed devotion, but they also literally needed constant nourishment. Like they would go hungry. They would, just like in Mesoamerica, if human beings didn't replenish the earth with their blood, and the forces of chaos and order were not tended to by sweeping and things like that, things could go really, really wrong. And so humans were not just thanking the all-powerful gods, that humans were an intimate part of tending these forces. This is a really different way of thinking about the relationship between divine and natural forces than what at least the official religion of the Spaniards. The reason why I paused right there is because I was thinking about all the ways that there were commonalities, but that have more to do with local, nature-oriented interpretations of Christianity that did exist in Spain. But of course, we have to remember that people brought those sorts of things with them. So again, we'll talk more about that later, but it is a little more complicated than what it looks like when we just rely on the sources of the elite sources of the conquerors. But at least in terms of the imposing official imperial religion of Christianity, the imperial version of Christianity, that it looks very different than this relationship of intimate interdependency between humans and divine forces. Probably on the day-to-day, once Spaniards and indigenous people started living together in different ways and understanding each other more in terms of language and things like that, there were the places of persistence of cultural traditions probably were often places where it connected with European local religion. And we can talk more about that as we go on. But what we have a representation of is this contest between imperial Christianity and these concepts of interdependency between humans and the forces of the cosmos and nature, etc. So when the Inca discouraged a particular type of offering or devotion to a particular mountain while encouraging devotion to another one, they weren't challenging these underlying notions of how the universe worked and the need for humans to play a role in the correct circulation of Sami, the life force. Rather, they were acknowledging and deepening these notions, even if they presented themselves as religious reformers who were trying to perfect or at least improve human beings' relationship with the divine. Okay, those are my words about the Andes. And I would love for us to talk more about that in relationship to the documents that you read or that you will have read, hopefully by the time you come to class and have also seen this video. All right. See you all soon.